Thank you all for being here with us on a beautiful summer day. Today, we're happy to have Pamela Morton back with us. As you know, she is an artist and university teacher who has been living and working in the south of France for over 30 years and is doing this lecture from France, which I just think is wonderful. She's also told me that she would be happy to do more of these talks for us in the future. So we're hoping to have her back either in the fall or winter for some more. Pamela, thank you again for being with us.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Gloria. And hello, everybody. Welcome. Give me a minute and I'll switch over to my slides. Good. Well, we're ready. So again, welcome. And today I want to talk about Matisse. So we've talked about Cézanne, we've talked about Van Gogh, and the third artist, or another artist, I should say, connected with the south of France is Matisse. And Matisse, his connection with the south, in fact, in the 19th century, in the south of France, Cézanne and Van Gogh are connected with Provence, but Matisse is connected with the Riviera, as well as Picasso. Matisse, born in 1869, dies in 1954. He's 84 years old when he died. He's born in the north in a small little town. I've got the name for you here, and I'm going to show you a map in a moment. And he dies in Nice. And I have a photograph of Matisse in his studio in Nice in 1926. So he's about 57 years old here. And the painting that's on the easel is one of the paintings we'll look at a little bit later from the important series that he did in the 1920s. Yes, I certainly do. And I imagine that you do as well. You connect Matisse with the south of France, with the Riviera, and in particular with Nice, because it's here in Nice where he spent the last almost 4 decades of his life. So 37 years he was in Nice, with one little exception, which we'll talk about during World War II. He moves inland from Nice to a little small hilltop town called Vence, but most of this period is spent just in Nice. And he really moves down on a permanent basis in 1917. So I put a little map in. So here's a map of the French Riviera, which, by the way, the French refer to as the Côte d'Azur, like the azure blue coast, which is absolutely right, because the color of the sky and the water is spectacular, and certainly something that interested Matisse. So you can see once we're down in the southeast corner of France, but we're a little, so Provence is just here, and this sort of little strip here that you can see enlarged on my map, and people debate about where the French Riviera starts. Some people say it starts with Saint-Tropez. Some people say it starts with Toulon. But anyway, everybody agrees that it continues moving up the coast just to the Italian border. So we have Nice, we have Monaco, and then we have the Italian border. I have for you over on the left a painting that Matisse did in Nice. And sorry, when I say this, it always makes me chuckle, because once I caught myself on the phone saying, I think I'll take my niece Alice to Nice to see the Matisse. And that's true. So I love the alliteration here, Matisse and Nice. And you can see in this painting, we have actually his model and his daughter, Marguerite, on a balcony overlooking the Promenade des Anglais, which is the big walkway along the Bay of Nice. And this is part of the Carnival Festival. So it's the Festival of Flowers that he painted in 1923. And I don't know if any of you have had the chance to go to Nice, and you should. I think it's one of my favorite destinations for my students. In fact, I will be teaching in the summer program this year, and I am planning a visit to Nice with my students. And what I like about it, and I think what the students appreciate too, is there's a little bit of everything. There's the sea, the beach, the boardwalk. There's a beautiful park up on the hill that you see in Matisse's paintings. There's the old town and the new town. Matisse was pretty much in the old town, although later he moves inland a little bit away from the sea to a hill called Simiez. And you know, Nice is an old city. The original name of Nice was Nike, not as in the shoe, but the goddess of victory. It was a Greek settlement, and then later it was a Roman settlement. And the Romans settled not down by the sea where the Greeks did, but inland on this hill called Simiez. And that's where Matisse spent the end of his life. And if you go to Nice and you go to this hill called Simiez, you can see the Matisse Museum. So here is a photograph of the Matisse Museum. And in fact, everything is very close together. The apartment building, and I'll show you a photograph of that later on, where Matisse lived and had his studio. The museum is across the street. Also across the street is a Roman amphitheater. And there's a wonderful olive tree grove. And at the end of the olive tree grove, there is a Franciscan monastery next to a cemetery, and that's where Matisse is buried. So if you go to Nice, make sure you see the old town, but don't forget also to go up the hill into this sort of residential area. In the 19th century, it was a kind of chic residential area, and that's where Matisse spent the last of his days, and that's where the museum is. So I've just talked about the connection between Matisse and Nice, but an important thing to know is that Matisse was actually a northerner, very much like Vincent van Gogh. He's someone who, when he came south, was just stunned by the beauty, by the bright light, by the variety of vegetation, how lush it is and green, and by the sparkling sea. Matisse is actually born not even near Paris, 120 miles north of Paris, right up on the Belgian border. So you can see my map here. Nice is close to Monaco in the south. Here's Paris, and 120 miles north and a little bit east. This is where Matisse is from, right on the Belgian border. He was born in this little town called La Cateau-Cambrésis, and I don't know if you've been there, but if you go, there is a Matisse museum there. And in fact, it was Matisse himself who set up this museum. And he even dictated how the paintings should be hung and what should be hung next to what. And it has, I think, the third largest collection of Matisse works anywhere. So there's a museum to see. And although the museum today is quite grand, the little town where he was born was really nothing. Soon after he was born, like a year after he was born, his family moved to a nearby town. In fact, it's only about 20 miles away, to a town called Beaune. And there, his father set up as a grain merchant, and his mother had a little shop where she sold materials to make hats, where she sold paints, items. Family lived right above the shop. In fact, the entrance to the grain depot where the father worked was around the corner. And this windows here, this is part of his mother's shop. And today, if you visit, it's now called, as you can see here, the family home of Matisse. So it too is a museum. Oh yes, that's the entrance to the grain shop around the corner. And like for Vincent van Gogh, this area where Matisse came from is flat, humid, wet, a lot of rain. It's treeless. And one of the big industries here is sugar beets. And Matisse actually spent the first 20 years of his life in this area, and there was not much happening here. And he actually referred to this time at the beginning of his life as being in prison. And he said every time a tree started to grow, they immediately cut it down because it wasn't to cast any shade over the sugar beets. The other big industry in this area, well, Boin had been since the Middle Ages a textile center. And it was a textile center when Matisse was growing up. In fact, everybody else in his family and everybody else in this village was involved with the textile industry. And this is, you can see two paintings that Matisse does at the beginning of his career, which show here one is the loom and here is a spinner. And also, I added a painting by Vincent van Gogh, and it's amazing how similar these two works are, the one by Matisse and the one by Van Gogh. So they had similar backgrounds. The only bit of color, there were no museums, there wasn't much in the way of culture. The only bit of color was the fabric that that was produced in these textile factories, and they produced fabrics for the fashion houses in Paris. So there were cashmeres and velvets and tulle. And you could see in my photograph here, this is a book of samples. You could see the wonderful colors and the wonderful designs. And so this was a little bit of a paradise amidst this very dark, bleak landscape. In fact, Matisse, throughout his life, collected textiles, and he called this his working library of colors and patterns. So he referred to all these textiles that he collected when he was working on different paintings, and I've just sort of arbitrarily picked two. In this one over on the left, he's got a Moroccan carpet, and you could see a Spanish shawl, and there are other fabrics here. And in the one, look at the variety of different textiles too. So he collected these, and these were inspiration for him. And Matisse was a great traveler, so he picked up textiles on his many travels. This is how Matisse starts off. In fact, also like Vincent van Gogh, he was a bit of a late bloomer. His father realized early on that Matisse, his son, had no real interest in going into the grain business. And so he sent him off to train as a lawyer. And Matisse spent 2 years training as a lawyer in Paris. And while he was in Paris, he never once visited a gallery or museum. He returned to this area where he grew up in, which is called Picardy. That's the name of the region. And while working as a law clerk, he had an attack of appendicitis. He ends up in the hospital, and his mother brings him from the shop that she ran a little paint box. It was for him to use while he was recuperating. And for Matisse, as you can see my quote here, he said, "This was a kind of paradise. I knew the minute I opened these paints and picked up the brush that this is what I wanted to do." So this was in 1889. He was about 20 years old. And this is how he starts painting and when he starts painting. Much to his father's chagrin, because he drops his law, his law career, and goes off to Paris to study. And you can see one of the first attempts at painting, very conventional, really, a sort of traditional approach where you see a strong light dark contrast. Clearly he's trying to give us a sense of the three-dimensionality of the objects that are in this work, but it's so completely different from what you're going to see later on. This is a little painting that's now in the museum in Nice. He wants to get into the École des Beaux-Arts, which is the art school in France. And he studies with different artists. They're sort of like feeder schools that you can go to. But he fails the entrance exam into the École des Beaux-Arts. He's taken in by another sort of teacher called Gustave Moreau. And Gustave Moreau is kind of a symbolist painter. And his work looks very different from Matisse's work. It looks very different from traditional work. And the good thing about Moreau was he sort of let his students find their own way. He encouraged them to develop their own style. He said, go to the Louvre, copy in the Louvre, but don't do just a straightforward copy. Express what you're feeling about what you're copying. And that was something kind of novel. So he had good luck in finding a teacher, and he produces the painting that you see over on the left. And this painting, still in a kind of earth tones, it shows a young woman. In fact, this woman became Matisse's lover, and they actually, when she was 19, 20 years old, they had a daughter named Marguerite, Matisse's only daughter. And she's reading here, and you can see this room that she's reading in. Of course, she's facing away from us. So this creates this kind of introspection, as if she's involved very much in her book and sort of taken on a journey through her reading. And the room here is full of different references to art, and maybe even to Matisse's studio. We see sculpture, and we see paintings, and we see a portfolio. And this is an important theme for Matisse, the theme of the artist's studio, his own studio. Now, this painting was a great success. It was purchased by the French government, and this actually made Matisse's father happy. And 2 years later, when Matisse produced another work, father and mother came to visit Matisse in Paris. This is the painting that Matisse showed a couple years later. And maybe you can see there's something different happening here. To us, it doesn't seem that different. But to visitors to the exhibition, well, they were laughing. They made fun of this. They said it was blurry, that they said that Matisse needed glasses. They said that he painted microbes on the dish, on the different dishes here. So, and of course, Matisse's parents were mortified, and actually Matisse's father cut off his allowance at this point. And what's happened is Matisse has discovered Impressionism. He met the artist Camille Pissarro. He saw the work of Vincent van Gogh. He actually, through a friend of his, acquired a couple of Van Gogh drawings. And he acquired a painting by Cézanne, by Gauguin. Impressionism and post-impressionism become very important to him. This painting shows us a kind of impressionistic approach because of the interest in light, the way the light comes in through the window and the reflections on all the different glassware here. This subject matter is also a theme that we'll see Matisse returns to. 2 years after that, Matisse gets married. They were only together for about 6 weeks. They met at a wedding. They happened to be sitting next to each other. And even though Amélie, his wife, swore that she would never marry an artist, that she would never marry a man with red hair, that she would never marry a man with a beard, well, Matisse had all those things, and they fell in love. They married. And they went to Corsica for their honeymoon because Amélie, she had family in the southwest of France, and one of her sisters had just obtained a position as a teacher in a school in Corsica. And Matisse was stunned. This was the first trip to the Mediterranean, his first encounter with this light. And here's what he writes. I went to Corsica one year, and it was by going to that marvelous country that I learned to know the Mediterranean. I was quite dazed by it all. Everything shines, everything is color and light. And you can see his colors here are a little bit stronger. They're not the pastels of Impressionism. And remember, he's been looking at Van Gogh, and you can see the brushwork is very visible. He's sort of layering on the paint. And this is a very happy time for Matisse, happy because his discovery of the Mediterranean, and happy because, of course, he's on his honeymoon as well. Matisse has his first one-man show in 1904. He's 35 when he has his one-man show, but he has some success, and this enables him to return to the Mediterranean, which he was dying to do ever since this honeymoon period. And while he was in Paris, he makes the acquaintance of an artist named Paul Signac. And Paul Signac liked to work with other artists. He actually wanted to, like Vincent van Gogh, create a kind of community of artists in the South where artists live and work together and sort of promote the progress of avant-garde art. And so Signac invites Matisse down to Saint-Tropez. This suited Matisse because he'd been reading about Signac and Signac's friend, teacher, colleague, named Seurat. This is a painting that Matisse does soon after arriving. I have a photograph which shows you, gives you an idea of what Saint-Tropez looks like. This is an important landmark, the bell tower here, which appears in Matisse's painting of this little seaside village. This was a very quaint fishing village. Today, you may know of Saint-Tropez because it's become the playground of the rich and famous. It was discovered before Signac and Matisse found it, or actually after they found it by Brigitte Bardot, for example. But then it was just a sleepy little place and hard to get to. Well, it was easier to get there by water than by land. In fact, that's how Signac arrives in Saint-Tropez. Signac was unhappy because his hero and friend and colleague and teacher, Georges Seurat, the pointillist, just died at age 31 in 1891. And unhappy and not sure about what was going to happen next, Signac, who was a sailor, puts his boat into the Mediterranean, and he sails into this wonderful harbor, which is now Saint-Tropez, and he writes a letter to his mother saying, "This is it. I've got enough material to keep me busy here for the rest of my life." This is a portrait of Paul Signac on his boat, which he named the Olympia after a famous painting by Manet, an artist he admired. And this is a painting that Signac did of the harbor of Saint-Tropez. And you can see it's using this little dots. And we talked about this when we talked about Van Gogh. But remember, the idea here is to break colors down, to divide them, because sometimes these artists are called the divisionists, to break them down to their basic components. And the idea is when you put a little dot of yellow next to a little dot of blue and you stand back, you see green, but the green you see is more intense because you've preserved the integrity of these two colors. And so the whole point was to increase a sensation of luminosity, of light. Signac's most famous work done in Saint-Tropez, a kind of manifesto. This is a huge painting that you can see over on the left. It's called In the Time of Harmony. And this was his vision, his idea of the South, this idea about an ideal society, about a kind of happy life. He's positioning himself against Paris. Paris is urban. The South, Saint-Tropez, is rural. Paris is industrial. In the South, it's a traditional way of life. Paris is about alienation, this new modern world, whereas the South is about community. And so that's this painting here. You can see that man and nature are in harmony at one. And the artists that Signac attracted down to Saint-Tropez all shared kind of similar vision of things. In fact, one of the artists that he worked closely with, who became a close friend of Matisse, his name was Henri Edmond Cross, and actually his original name was Delacroix, but since there's a famous artist named Delacroix, he changed it to Cross, which is the anglicized version of Delacroix. And you can see in Cross's painting too, this sort of ideal world where people are relaxing, leisure, sun. In fact, that was the idea, that there's a balance of work and play, and a kind of happy world in the South. Matisse picks up on this theme, and he also experiments with Signac and Seurat's idea of pointillism, but he's using it in a different way here. What he's interested in are the little touches, and of course he's heightened and exaggerated the use of color here. He makes a first study for this, which is shows his wife and his son in a little bay near Saint-Tropez. And then he makes the second study, and a painting based on the study, and that's what I'm showing you here. But he adds into this scene these nudes, like nymphs who've invaded this sort of picnic and given it a kind of classical feel. And the title of this painting, Luxe, Calme et Volupté, well, it's a reference to a poem by Baudelaire called Invitation to a Voyage, in which Baudelaire describes a world in a warm glow of light. And that's something like we have here in this painting. Signac was very proud of this painting. He felt that, Matisse is following in my footsteps. And Signac actually purchased this painting and hung it in his living room. But Matisse wasn't too happy with Signac. Like Vincent van Gogh, he became impatient with this way of working because it was time consuming. And he had probably heard from Signac, who, as I mentioned, was a sailor, that Signac had visited a place a little further along the coast, in fact, the other direction, a little town called Collioure. And this is just on the border with Spain. And you can see, for the sake of contrast, I have a painting by Signac, lower right, made of the little dots. And here is Matisse's version when he shows up there about 20 years later. And here's a photograph of this little another sleepy little fishing village. And look at this. You can see that it's so different from what Signac has done. It's like an explosion here. And everything that's brown is just raw canvas showing. And the brushstrokes are very excited, and the color is very excited as well. Well, when Matisse moves to Collioure, he's with his wife and his daughter Marguerite. Actually, Amélie, his wife, adopts Marguerite. So this is Matisse's child from a former relationship. And he also invites a younger artist by the name of Derain. And he had met Derain, André Derain, up in Paris, and he invites him to come down, and they two work together. And Derain is very interested in Matisse's way of working, and you can see the same subject matter in this painting by Derain. And what these artists are doing is they're not mixing colors. In fact, they're using color straight out of the tube. They often use color in a kind of unnaturalistic way. In other words, the colors don't necessarily correspond with what they're painting. The brushwork is very loose. So these intense, bright colors, often unnatural colors, loose, broken, visible brushwork. This is typical of a movement, the first modern art movement at the beginning of the 20th century, founded by Matisse and Derain, called Fauvism. And Fauvism comes from the French word fauve, because when these paintings were first shown up in Paris in 1905, well, a critic, that's how he described them, that these were paintings made by uncivilized men, angry beasts, that it had looked like these artists had picked up pots of color and just flung it at the canvas. So here's another one by Derain, and everything that's white is just the surface of the canvas here. And in fact, it has a nickname, the white horse, and the horse is down here, but the horse hasn't actually been painted. It's the cart and the bridle, that everything around the horse has been painted, but not the horse itself. Two beach scenes. And Matisse, you can see, has painted the beach red. And when asked about this, Matisse said, yes, it's true. I painted it red. And then afterwards, I said to myself, oh, a beach isn't red, it's yellow. So I painted it out and painted it yellow. And then I looked at it and I thought, that's not right. And he painted it red, back the way it originally was. So this idea that color doesn't have to correspond to what he's seeing. In fact, Matisse's famous line was, when I paint green, it's not grass. When I paint blue, it's not sky. So brushwork, color are used expressively. And here's another view of Collioure. You can see the unnatural colors, the pink mountains here and the red earth. And one of his most famous paintings that was shown in this exhibit that gave this movement its name is this one called The Open Window. The window is another important theme in Matisse's work. And in fact, since the Renaissance, there's been this idea that that's what a painting is. A painting is a window, something we look through at something else. As if, and I don't know if you can see me, but here's my piece of paper, as if this is the surface of a painting and I turn it to the side and this is where everything's located, in a box behind the surface. But what Matisse starts doing is directing our attention just to the surface. It becomes very flat. In fact, you can see it's like squares within squares here. And within each square, the brushwork is different. And so this brings our attention back to the surface of the painting. And also, instead of using traditional modeling techniques, light and dark, he's using, like Vincent van Gogh did, opposite color combinations, complementary colors. So we have this sort of turquoisey green and this sort of raspberry color combination. Maybe his most famous painting from this period is this one, A Woman with a Hat. This is a portrait of his wife, Amélie. And I think critics and public were most upset by this painting because this is something that's sacred, a portrait. A portrait is supposed to give us an idea about what a person looks like, or maybe tell us something about the personality of the sitter. And so that's why they were so upset with this, because Matisse here is tampering with something very sacred, doing something very taboo with all his colors. Everybody went wild. Even his fellow artists actually got a woman to paint her face green and show up in the gallery to look at this. There were signs all around town that said, be careful when you use turpentine. And the artist went around and changed the signs. Instead of saying, be careful when you use turpentine, be careful when you see Matisse. Matisse makes you crazy. So there was this incredible reaction to this painting. And in fact, she's dressed in a very sort of bourgeois outfit. Look at her glove, the fan, and this incredible hat. And I should point out that Amélie was a hat maker, and she's the one that kept the family afloat, when Matisse wasn't making money, because if his work took a new direction, he would go that way. He wasn't concerned with sales. So you can read that this painting has a kind of symbolic importance too, because it's Amélie and then this huge hat. When Matisse was asked, what was she actually wearing? What color was it really? Matisse made a fun joke. He said, black, of course. And in a way, this painting is so colorful, it almost goes full circle to black. Well, undaunted by the criticism, Matisse produces this portrait of Amélie. And it got the nickname the green stripe because of the way the face is divided. You know, traditionally in portraiture, because the symmetry of the face can be sort of boring, so often artists put one side in shade and one side in light. And here, Matisse has just changed the color combinations. And if you cover up one side of the painting and then cover up the other side of the painting, you can see that one side is sort of more realistic than the other. But he's using these opposite color combinations to give it this kind of intensity and excitement. Another important work, which also drew heavy criticism, was Bonheur de vivre, the joy of life. And it was criticized because it was too simple, it was too pared down, it was too schematic. And also, Matisse wasn't respecting the rules of perspective. He wasn't creating an illusion of deep space, because even though this group in the background is smaller than those in the foreground, look, there are scale shifts that just don't make any sense in terms of the relationship between these figures. And of course, the hot coloring was something else that disturbed. You can see these figures are all relaxing, playing music, dancing, smooching, reclining. So this is a painting about a kind of sensuality. And the sensuality comes not just from the poses of the figures and the actions that they're involved in, and the fact that they're nude, but this kind of hot coloring and the sensual linear quality that we see around the figures and in the trees. I'll read you my quote. This is a famous quote about Matisse's work. He said, "What I dream of is an art of balance, of purity and serenity, devoid of troubling or disturbing subject matter, like a comforting influence, a mental balm, something like a good armchair in which one rests from physical fatigue." And that's not how this painting was read at the time. It was read as being aggressive and violent. But for Matisse, it's about sensuality. And in fact, we can understand this better when we can see a response to Matisse's painting, The Joy of Life. The painting he did called Woman with a Hat was bought by Gertrude and Leo Stein. They were disturbed by the painting. In fact, Leo de Stein said, "It's the nastiest smear of paint I've ever seen." But they knew it was an important work and they bought it. And they also purchased works from Picasso, who had just recently arrived in Paris. And it was in the Stein's apartment that Matisse and Picasso first met. And thus began this kind of healthy rivalry between the two artists, where Matisse would try something and then Picasso would, or he'd answer it, and they would sort of play off each other. And Picasso, who was anything but a humble man, at one point he said, "If I didn't paint like I paint, then I would paint the way Matisse painted." He said the only contemporary artist he appreciated was Matisse. And that was mutual. Matisse also appreciated him, but they were wary of each other at the same time. So look, if Matisse's idea of art is about relaxation, consolation, escape, a kind of paradise. Remember his first paint box, something comforting. And Van Gogh shared all these ideas. For Picasso, the idea was, no, painting should be something that, like a slap across the face, something that wakes us up, makes us think. And in comparison, Picasso's figures are sharp and angular. This painting has been described as being like splintered glass. You can see that here in this painting, Matisse is just delighting in color and patterns. Look at the wallpaper here, this beautiful raspberry color and this wonderful sort of arabesque motif in the wallpaper, and how that wallpaper seems to come down from the wall, flooding the rest of the room, absorbing the table, because of course the tablecloth shares the same pattern. And then we have this little window, a kind of opening, a little bit of relief, a little bit of air. We have a somewhat of a suggestion of space in the way that this figure is moved in here between the table and the background. You know, in French, we say to compose a work of art. Well, we do in English as well, but also, as this woman is doing here, she's composing a table. To set the table in French is to compose. So it's almost like this is a stand-in for Matisse himself. Matisse had a couple of loyal patrons. One was a Russian who made a fortune in the textile industry. So they had this kind of interest and background in common. And Shishkin, his name was, commissioned Matisse to do 2 paintings for a staircase and a landing in his palace in Moscow. And this is Matisse did a painting called Music and a painting called Dance that went to Shukin. And this one was on the landing, which might explain the fact that when you come up the stairs, you're carried into the painting by this figure. And so that the movement isn't too fast. Oops, sorry, I was too fast. Let me go back. This figure is larger and sort of slows down the movement. And look at these figures. They're very simple. Someone's described them as being like beanbag dolls. And we have just 3 colors, green, blue, and red for the figures. And here again, you might think back to Vincent van Gogh's painting of the potato eaters, where he said his idea was that there should be a correspondence between form and content. And the same thing here, that this painting is about movement. And can you imagine if the figures were done in a kind of meticulous classical way, it wouldn't have the same sensation of this wonderful spirit of movement that is in this painting of the dance. Here are 2 studio paintings, and Matisse has done the same thing here, where the wallpaper and the pattern on the floor are the same, so how that flattens it. In fact, you could say that the whole painting looks like a kind of collage with different scraps of gift wrap paper pasted onto each other. So just to make sense of it, you can see here's an open window. Here's a screen, a decorative screen. Here's a mirror mirroring the table. There's a portfolio against the mirror. And the painting is called Interior with Eggplants, which is almost sort of tongue-in-cheek because the eggplants are so small here. But notice the movement around the eggplants and then how it becomes more exuberant in this wonderful pattern on the screen here. Then we have mirrors and a sort of doorway that leads into another space behind. At around the same time, he does a famous painting called The Red Studio. And now the walls, the floor is red. And in fact, he's just given emphasis to his own works. So they're almost like postage stamps on this flat red ground. Matisse takes a trip to Morocco. In fact, he makes 2 trips to Morocco. And he doesn't really go because he wants to find something picturesque to paint, something exotic. It's true, he gets interested in the exotic atmosphere of Morocco, but the real reason he went is because of the light. It's inexpensive and there's a lot of light. Matisse loves this light, this intense light, and here you can paint all year round. That's his idea. As per usual, just after arriving, he does a kind of overview of the Bay of Tangiers, which you can see on the left. And on the right is his painting of the tomb, the domed structure here, is the tomb of a Muslim saint called a marabout. And Matisse here is talking about the brilliant light through blues and white, through the sort of heat of the white and yellow and a bit of red, and the coolness here of the blue and the green. Think back once again to Vincent van Gogh and how Vincent van Gogh, when he first arrives in exotic Arles, he paints a young Japanese girl, a native girl, native to Arles, and he paints the postman because he was so excited by the postman's wonderful uniform. Matisse here, too, you can see, is interested by the exotic costumes of the people and that he paints. This is actually the doorman of the hotel where he was staying. And this is a woman recruited through the doorman for Matisse to paint here. Her name was Zora. And this is a warrior from an area near Tangiers called the Reef, in his clothes. And again, look at in his portrait of his wife with the yellow stripe, how he's divided the canvas sort of in half. From this period, he does on the right and on the left, 2 views of Tangiers. And in the middle is a portrait of Zora on a roof. And he actually conceived of these 3 paintings as being hung together as a kind of unit. And of course, one can't escape thinking about a triptych, which is a traditional 3-panel altarpiece for churches. And often in the center, you have the Virgin and Child. But in this case, you've got Zora sitting on the roof. Look at the slant of light that comes in, the way it picks up part of her costume here. We can see her slippers. She's on a prayer rug. And there's this wonderful bowl of goldfish. Goldfish for Matisse becomes a sort of symbol of a life of contemplation, for relaxation, and also for a kind of paradise lost as well. Orientalist painting was something that was very popular at the end of the 19th century, and I thought I'd give you an example so that you can see how Matisse's version of Orientalism is so far removed from this. Over on the left, this painting, which looks like a photograph, and this is deliberate, the idea here is to convince us of the reality of this scene. But this scene is a complete sort of fantasy about North Africa. And also you can see there's a kind of narrative content here. We see the snake charmer and this young boy and this sort of motley crew watching this performance. And Matisse's painting is quite different. It's about a mood. It conjures up a mood. Look, we don't have any faces of the people. We don't have a lot of information about this room they're in. And again, of course, they're gazing into the goldfish bowl. When he returns from Morocco, he's up in Paris. Look, it's 1914. And so he does the painting that you see on the right. And here's an earlier painting he does of Notre Dame, because while he was in Paris, he had a studio that overlooked the Seine, and he had a good view of Notre Dame. And you can see that the painting he does after returning from Morocco is quite different. In fact, it started off as looking more realistic, like the one on the left. And then Matisse began to paint areas out so that you can see it becomes very abstract and flat again. And maybe you'd be hard put to say that this is a painting of Notre Dame if I hadn't given you the title or this other one to compare it with. This is a period, Matisse is now going into a period of experimentation. And look at this one and think back to that painting of the dance with the red figures, green ground, blue sky. This is quite different. In that, there was this kind of exuberant energy. And this one is much more austere, much more geometric, much more rigid. The figures are kind of columnar. And what's happening here is two things. Matisse is responding to the experiments of Picasso in Cubism, because the second important art movement at the beginning of the 20th century to come after Fauvism is Cubism. So Matisse here is experimenting with Cubism, and you can see even his palette is different here. It's more muted, and that was the case for Cubist works because they were more interested in form rather than color, more like Cézanne than Van Gogh. And the other thing that's going on at this time is World War I. So that's another way you might express something more somber here, something more serious. Matisse actually wanted to sign up, but he was 44 years old, and he had health problems, so he was not allowed to sign up. However, Matisse with Amélie has two sons, and his eldest son, Jean, has just been taken into the army and is actually working near Marseille. And Matisse and his wife are worried about their son, Jean. And Matisse goes south to visit him, and he brings him supplies. He buys him a hot meal. He brings him some sweaters. And while Matisse is there, he spends time in L'Estaque, where Cézanne had worked near Marseille. And Matisse, like Renoir did when Renoir went to visit Cézanne, he catches cold out in the Mistral wind. He catches pneumonia, and doctors convince him. Oop, somebody might mute. He's told to move further east to the Riviera, where the climate, and there's no Mistral, where that would be better for him. When he first arrived, it's raining cats and dogs. And after about 4 weeks, he's just about to sort of throw in the towel when suddenly the sun comes out and he changes his mind. And of course, as you know, this is where he stays until he dies. Here's a painting showing the Promenade des Anglais in the rain. And this is a self-portrait that Matisse does soon after arriving in Nice. And you can see he's got his suitcase between his legs here. And he's painting inside his hotel room. Remember, it was raining. You can see his umbrella hanging from the washstand here. And look at the way he's dressed. He's not dressed like a local. He's not dressed like an artist. He's dressed like a tourist. Huh? You can see he's sort of like a fish out of water. And he's a fish out of water also because this is a transitional moment. As I say, he's experimenting with Cubism, but it's not really his temperament. And he realizes that close to Nice, in a town called Cagnes-sur-Mer, Renoir is living. Renoir, the great master of Impressionism. So he decides to pay him a visit. And Matisse is excited by what Renoir is doing. Renoir dies in 1919 at the age of 78. This is, look, he's done this painting in 1919, a huge painting of bathers. So here is Renoir still working right up to the end of his life. And he's working even though he's suffering from rheumatoid arthritis. And while the figures in his paintings, the bathers, are becoming more and more voluptuous, he himself is becoming more and more emaciated, crippled by this condition. And so Matisse is very excited by his late work and also very moved by the example of Renoir. And I just have a photograph of the house where Renoir lived and worked at the end of his life, which has now been turned into a museum. So Matisse, encouraged by Renoir, goes to work. He's living in hotels on the Promenade des Anglais, facing the Bay of Nice, in different hotel rooms. Sometimes the hotels are requisitioned by the army and he has to move. There's a floating casino that no longer exists, but done in a very exotic style. In fact, all the buildings in Nice are done in an exotic style because the idea is that Nice is basically Africa. When you're looking over this body of water, you're looking at North Africa. And so the buildings are built in to look like, well, you have examples of Islamic architecture and Russian architecture and all sorts of exotic buildings in Nice, which inspires Matisse. While he's there, he paints from his hotel rooms. And it's interesting, he goes for the light, but he doesn't really paint outdoors like the Impressionists do. He's inside his room with the windows thrown open. And so once again, we have this idea of a painting within a painting because we have a window view framed by the room. And here are three examples. He describes the light in Nice as soft and tender despite its brilliance. And again, remember that this is wartime, and there must have been something very comforting about these paintings with these lacy curtains moving in a gentle sea breeze, the warm climate of Nice, and something about the safety, the security, the intimacy of these hotel rooms. And here's two more, and very unusual. Matisse has put the figure over to one side, so she's not really the focus. She's balanced by this table with the flowers here. And in fact, our eyes sort of is led out the French windows to the sea and the palm tree behind. Same thing on the right. She's actually not even sitting in the room. She's seated on the balcony. And look at the different points of view combined. We seem to be looking down, bird's eye view of the floor and this chair. Look at the shape of the chair here, and notice the shape of the transom window. So it's almost like she's held between those two things. And we also have a painting of her on the wall here. Matisse was asked by Diaghilev to work for the Ballet Russe, and he comes up with a set of costumes. You can see them here. He's involved with the ballet called the Nightingale's Song. Here's Matisse feeding one of the ballerinas. Diaghilev had been involved in a ballet called Scheherazade earlier. So you can see that these ballets are exotic, and Matisse is in this exotic setting. And he does a series of paintings in Nice. In fact, there are two subjects that interest him. One, the window. Two, what we call the odalisque, which is usually a reclining model, dressed or semi-undressed in a kind of exotic setting, exotic costume. And these are clearly based on memories of Morocco. And in fact, there's another source for this. In Nice, there is a booming film industry. Nice was the Hollywood of France. And just after the war, they produced a whole spate of films on the theme of the Sheikh. Remember Rudolph Valentino and that series, silent films. And they were doing the same thing in Nice. And Matisse actually found his model. She was an extra for some of these harem-scarum movies. And so she was very happy to get dressed up in this costume and pose for Matisse. And here are some of the examples from this series. And again, this is different from traditional Orientalist paintings of the odalisque because she's not the focus in the same way. And usually the figure is sexy, sensuous, And look at her face, she's done in a kind of schematic way. Also, she seems to have slipped down to the bottom of the painting. Clearly what's of interest here are the colors and the patterns. Look at the different fabrics back here. And look at this figure here. He seems to be playing within the flat, heavily patterned background, and then this three-dimensional, almost kind of cubist figure, a little bit like a Cézanne figure. Plus, Matisse made no attempt to sort of make us believe that this was actually an odalisque in an Oriental environment. He used all his textiles from plus other props he picked up from flea markets in Nice. And in his studio, so now he's moved into a studio into the old town, he would set up all these different things, as you can see in the photograph here, and paint these figures of the odalisque. And he says, and again, I'll quote, "The entire arrangement of my picture is expressive. The place occupied by the figures, the empty spaces around them, the proportion, everything has its share." So in other words, the expression of this painting didn't come just from the expression on the face or the pose of the figure or the fact that this is a sexy figure. It's everything, that the background is as important as the figure in the foreground. A lot of people were unhappy with these paintings because they felt that Matisse, after being a kind of avant-garde hero with Fauvism, is now returning to an old trope, Orientalism. Plus, the government was starting to buy these Orientalist paintings. So that was a kind of kiss of death as far as hipster artists were concerned. But Matisse comes back in the 30s. So he's doing the windows and the odalisque in the 20s. And in the 30s, he's asked by Barnes, and maybe you've been to the Barnes Foundation, to do a mural. And this mural had to fit in these strange spaces, these sort of arches over the window. In fact, Barnes was a collector of Matisse. You can see one of Matisse's Morocco paintings in the collection just here. Well, the obvious thing to do would be to have something centered here. Here's another scene with something centered, and in the third lunette, the same idea. But Matisse hasn't done that here. He's tried to connect, to link these three circular shapes, again, using the figure of the dancer. The other thing he does that sort of puts him back on the map in terms of avant-garde art is this painting. This is, and he starts off doing something very realistic, and he reworks it and reworks it, the same painting over and over a 3-month period. He had his sort of studio assistant, muse and helper, which we'll talk about in a moment, photograph the different stages of this paintings. And what you end up with here is bold simplification. And another thing that's important in Matisse, as we've mentioned, is not just the figure and then a background, but for him, composition was a combination of both positive and negative spaces. Positive is the figure. Negative are the spaces that are created around the figure. Sometimes I do an exercise with my students and I tell them to draw this, but not drawing the figure, but by drawing, if you can follow my arrow, this shape and this shape and that shape. And that's what creates the interest in this painting. But this simplification is what was new and exciting. The model for that painting is also here, and her name was Lydia Delektorskaya. She was born in Siberia. Her father was a doctor. She lost both her parents to epidemics at the age of 12. She was orphaned. She is accepted into the School of Medicine at the Sorbonne in Paris, but she doesn't have enough money to pay for her studies. She gravitates to the south of France because in Nice, there's an important Russian community. She's hired by Matisse when he's working on the mural project. And at the end of the project, Matisse gives her 500 euros and say, here, this is to help you get started with your life. Her partner blows it all in one evening in the casino. And Matisse later learns that she was trying to make the money back to repay Matisse by doing marathon dancing. Matisse, horrified, takes her back in and hires her as a companion for his wife, who's having health problems. And eventually she moves from doing that to becoming a model for Matisse. And Matisse and Amélie actually break up in 1939. Matisse has just moved into this important apartment in Nice. And Amélie says she suspected him of being involved with Lydia, but Lydia was 40 years younger. Not that that would have stopped Picasso, but anyway, apparently nothing was going on. And Matisse says, I pick you, but it was too late. She leaves. Lydia tries to commit suicide, shoots herself in the chest. And then Matisse takes her back in after that. And she becomes muse, model, studio assistant, studio manager, caretaker, until Matisse dies in 1954. And she was a very different kind of model from the others, who were Mediterranean types. And she was called the Ice Princess. She was blonde. Well, it was around that time, of course, that World War II starts. And Matisse, living in this very important hotel up on the hill, which was a very conspicuous landmark, was advised to move inland. And he does to this hilltop town called Vence. At the same time, he's diagnosed with abdominal cancer. And they have to do emergency surgery. Matisse is bedridden for 3 months. And he says to his doctor, please just give me 3 more years so I can finish my work. He almost died and he knew it. But in the end, he gets 10 more years to his life. However, he never fully recuperates. He can no longer stand for long periods. And most of the work he does, because he continues to work right up until his death, is done from his wheelchair or from his bed. And because of this, he develops a new way of working. He starts doing paper cutouts. You can see him in his bed here. He often worked with a long bamboo pole and a piece of charcoal attached to it. Here he is doing the paper cutouts works. And this is the house in Vence, which still exists. It's now a place that they use as a residency for artists. And the name of it is Villa Le Rêve, the Villa of the Dream. He produces jazz, and this is his first important work using paper cutouts. He'd actually used paper cutouts before when he was designing, trying to figure out the placement of the figures of the dancers for the Barnes Foundation, and also when he was designing the costumes for the Ballet Russe. But that was an ends to a means. And so now this becomes an end in and of itself. This is a small book called Jazz. Matisse was a fan of music, in particular jazz, and the text is handwritten. And so on one page you have a very brilliant colored based on cutouts, and on the other side just this sort of black and white of his calligraphy. He was inspired in this. His inspiration came from the circus, came from folk tales, and also from the different travels he had made in his life. And you can see by the wonderful bright colors that Matisse here is elated. He's been given this reprieve, and this is what he calls his second life. And so there's something very joyous and cheerful. Here we have a horse and rider. We see the ringmaster's whip here, and maybe a bit of the, I can't think of what, the ring here, and maybe the skirt of a rider. Over on the right, the Kodamas were a trapeze act. So you could see the two blue trapeze, and then the sort of spiraling movement, the two trapeze artists. And to do the net underneath them, he doesn't draw the net, but he does the black squares, spaces in between the net. And sometimes these things have other meanings. For example, Pierrot the clown, his funeral. This is obviously also a reference to the fact that Matisse narrowly escaped his own funeral. On the right, this is the story of Icarus, and you know that Icarus flew too close to the sun, and so here we see him falling against a blue sky with yellow stars. But given the context of World War II, you could also read this as these are shells exploding, and this black figure is a corpse, and maybe that red hole is a bullet wound. Also, for this one, The Nightmare of the White Elephant, we see a white elephant bouncing on a ball. Matisse said, this elephant has to balance on this tiny ball. He's under the dazzling lights of the circus, and he's dreaming of his former life in the jungle. And these red arrows, he explained, are his thoughts of his old life. Well, another way to understand this painting is Matisse had just learned that his daughter, Marguerite, who had been involved with the resistance, had been caught and was being questioned and tortured by the Gestapo. In Vence, okay, have a look at this picture here. Matisse noticed there was an ugly stain on the wall, and he cuts out from a sheet of white paper the shape of a bird to cover the stain. And he likes that. And then he starts adding more and more shapes until finally you can see over on the right, this is what his wall looked like. And in fact, these are memories of a trip he took when he was in the States and saw Barnes. He'd also been to the South Pacific. He was interested in Tahiti, where Gauguin had been, but he didn't do any work while he was there. And suddenly, again, this idea of paradise returns to him during World War II and after recuperating from this surgery. And he does these two paper cutout. They're actually kind of installations, and they're later turned into tapestries. One's called The Sky and one's called The Sea. And of course, some of the fabrics he picked up in the South Pacific. Here are traditional fabrics. I don't know how to pronounce it, but T55. And here are kind of tapa bark cloth. And you can see the all over patterning, which is part of the inspiration for these designs. Again, look at his room here on the left, just covered with paper cutouts. And here are two of the paper cutouts. These have now been lifted and framed. And you can see that it's just an orange background with a white shape. And then he slips a bit of red underneath paper, and then he decorates it with little green squares. While he's in Vence, he receives a knock on the door from a woman who was connected with a convent across the street, a Dominican convent. And this woman knocked on his door because she had been his nurse when he was recovering from surgery. And in the meantime, she'd become a nun and joined this convent. She learned that he'd moved across the street. And she said, you know, we're interested in redoing our chapel. And after watching you work, I was bold enough to try my hand at a couple of ideas for designs. Would you have a look at them and give me your opinion? Well, Matisse eventually took over the whole project. And this is the Chapel of the Rosary, which you can visit in Vence, which he referred to as his greatest masterpiece, because he was interested in light, interested in color expressing light, but now he said he was actually working with light itself, because it's light that comes through the stained glass windows. And you can see his designs here using green, blue, and yellow, representing green for vegetation, yellow the sky, blue for the sea and the sky. Did I say that right? Well, anyway, you know what I mean. And this over here is a study for his first idea for the stained glass window. It's called The Bees. because they look like bees, but actually it was also a kind of nod to the Dominican nuns whose habit was black and white. This is a very modern chapel, unlike no other chapel, because it's basically all white, apart from the stained glass windows. And he does ceramic murals, and it's amazing, but when the light comes through these stained glass windows, you actually see purples and pinks that light up this chapel. He did something very radical. He put the Stations of the Cross all together in one mural, and that's what you see at the end here. He was responsible for all elements of the design, the altarpiece, the crucifix, the murals, the confessional doors, the baptismal font, the choice of the tiles for the roof. And he even designed the vestments that the priests would wear. So as you can imagine, this nearly white chapel, this sort of black and white graphic effect, and then the clergy moving through as these spots of wonderful color. This is from the end of his life, called The Blue Nude. And here's the way Matisse worked with paper cutouts. If you look, for example, at the leg here, you can see there are different shades of blue. That's because these are different pieces of blue paper. He would have his assistants paint sheets of paper. He would tell them what colors to do, and then he would cut out shapes, and then he'd have his assistants pin these to the wall. So he'd say a little bit more to the left, a little bit more to the right. And in fact, to create this leg, he kept adding on bits of blue paper. So it's this additive process, like the way artists work with clay, when they keep building up a form. So it's not a single form, it's made of different little pieces. And here's just two photographs to show you Matisse using these huge shears, the kind that I'm sure the members of his family in the textile industry used. And you can see his assistant pinning these things to the wall. So he's creating a kind of environmental artwork. In fact, that's what he says. He writes in a letter, "I've made a little garden all around me where I can walk. There are leaves, fruits, a bird." And you can see some of the exotic items he had in his studio up on the hill in Nice. And this is what it looks like today. It's been removed from the wall. And I think I've just got one more slide for you. And sorry, I have to read one more quote. "I had noticed that in the work of the Orientals, the drawing of the empty spaces left around leaves counted as much as the drawing of the leaves themselves." So there's that idea again about design and pattern and positive and negative space as being important in creating a composition. And here are my last two. He dies in 1954. As I mentioned, he dies at age 84. At age 83, he creates the work on the right. It's called The Snail. And usually we think of a snail as curves in a kind of spiral. And there is a spiral movement, but then we have these squares of color and the wonderful way in which these colors work together. This is a huge work, over 9 feet by 9 feet. And another late work, The Sorrow of the King. And this is probably a reference to a painting by Rembrandt. Rembrandt did many self-portraits, and he did a painting called Saul Playing for the King. And the music, of course, is to calm the king. And so we see like the musicians here and these wonderful yellow shapes, like the notes of music. And we see a kind of swirling form, almost like a kind of dancing odalisque. So this is clearly a painting about memory. It's a kind of portrait about nostalgia and about looking back. And of course, these works were dismissed when these paper cutouts were first shown. People said, "Oh, Matisse has lost it. He's gone senile. He's like a little kid with a pair of scissors and construction paper." But these are, of course, are now some of his the works that are the best loved of Matisse. And thank you. Well, let me come out of my slide share to see if anybody would like to ask some questions. And so feel free to unmute and you can ask me directly if you're not shy. Don't be shy.
Thank you so much, Pamela. That was wonderful.
Oh, you're welcome, Liz. Yeah. Has anybody been to Nice? Have you been to the Matisse Museum?
I love I love the chapel in Vence. The light was so spiritual being in that place. It really was, because the whole building is totally white, even from the outside. And when you get inside and see the colors of the light beaming through that stained glass window, it was really just beautiful, just very spiritual.
I agree with you, Patty. It's magical, and it
is.
Yeah, I often get goosebumps. You know, I've been there many times, and yet there is a sort of wonderful feel about the light, and it seems much bigger than it is because of the light. And it's so simple, and yet it's so he's got the essence. It's all there. It is absolutely.
Yeah.
Pamela, are there other artists during the time of Matisse who worked with collage?
Picasso does. Picasso does, even in Cubism. And here's how it happens. The Cubist works become so abstract, so removed from reality, that at one point, Picasso starts adding actually pieces of the real world into the paintings as a way of anchoring it down. Little bits of wallpaper, little bits of newspaper. And so that's a kind of collage, but it's quite different from the collage technique of Matisse, because what Matisse was doing was, as I said, he would have assistants take paper, paint it certain colors that he would specify, and then he'd cut into it. And you can see, and that was one of the things I meant to point out, but maybe you saw it, like in the works on the walls in Vence, he would use the positive shapes that he cut out, but also the negative shapes to create these collages.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that wasn't something that Picasso was doing. And Picasso was one of the ones to say at the beginning, has he lost his mind? But he quickly changed his tune because he realized, no. Matisse is right, as always. and another story about Picasso Matisse is when Matisse dies in 1954, Picasso doesn't die till 1973. Picasso says, I'm lost. What'll I do now? I've lost my sounding board. I've lost Matisse. And what does he do? He paints a series of odalisques, just like Matisse had done.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I wondered if the paintings in the Barnes Museum along the ceiling there, did he do cutouts for those, or they were just painted panels?
No, you're right. So he had seen Barnes in Philadelphia, and then he went back to his studio in Nice. He rented a garage that was roughly the same size, and he used paper cutouts as a way of working out his design, because the thing was so huge. So if you painted a big figure and it didn't quite look right, you'd have to paint it all out again. And he realized that, well, no, if I can use paper and I can get this right. And here's a story about this. When he finally finished, so he uses paper cutouts, again, as an ends to a mean. He finishes the mural, he packs it up, sends it to Barnes. They opened it up and it doesn't fit. The measurements that Matisse was working with were wrong.
Metric.
And so he had to do a second mural, and the first one is now up in Paris in the Museum of Modern Art, but the second one is in the Barnes Foundation.
Well,
you're right, that was a good question. He works with paper cutouts as a way of working out the design.
Did he do the second one with paper cuts, or did he come there to paint it?
I'm not sure. It's possible. I'm not sure if he just sort of, if he kind of reproduced it, but because it's basically the same, but it's just slightly different dimension. I don't know. I don't know exactly. But certainly for the first one he did, because he wasn't sure how to link these three shapes together and how big the figures needed to be. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We do have one question typed in the chat box from
Oh,
Lisa.
yeah. Thank you.
What do you consider Matisse's greatest influence on later artists? Is it his use of color, shapes, or composition? Sorry, color or shapes and composition?
All of those things.
Yeah.
We think of Matisse. So it's interesting because we've looked at Van Gogh and we've looked at Cézanne. And I think I mentioned last time that you can say that Matisse builds on Van Gogh because of his interest in color, because he's using color in an expressive way. But like Cézanne, he's also very interested in what is a painting, how to make a painting, that a painting has its own internal logic, that it's not about reproducing the world. So composition is key for him. And yes, patterns, positive shapes, negative shapes. We often call Matisse the great colorist of the early 20th century. So we usually associate Matisse with color and Picasso with form, Picasso building on what Cézanne has done. But I think you can also see that Matisse is a great draftsman, because to make these paintings work and to have that kind of simplification that works, yeah, he has to have a sense of shape and line and how to put them together to make a kind of composition. So yeah, all those things are important, but we usually talk about him in terms of color and Picasso in terms of form.
I wanted to make a comment. When I was teaching 5th grade, 6th grade art, I presented Matisse's cutouts to the kids. And the one about the circus in particular, it was amazing to me once they started to see the representation through the shapes and forms and colors. I just remembered when you were showing the trapeze. The kids found the trapeze, they figured out the trapeze artists and the ring, and they found animals. There's all the circus animals are in the pink or the red all around it, and they took off with it. So I gave them a project for them to create their own cutouts and abstract it like that. They had more fun doing that, and the results were phenomenal.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Oh, Patty, that's great.
It was a great project for them. They loved it. So.
And I will say that adults like it too, because I did a Zoom session with a group of adults and we did a Matisse cutout project.
Yeah,
and it was enormous fun. Yeah, we did that during lockdown, and that was, it was fun.
Yeah. He's very enlightening as far as your imagination, where you can take it with the cutouts and move it around. You're not stuck in like with painting. Right. It's oil painting. You put it down, and yourself. It's hard to move it around. The cutouts are ideal for that.
Exactly. And you might look. There's a little YouTube. It's very short, like 2 minutes or something, but it's a film of Matisse cutting out shapes. Mm-hmm. And of course, he goes very quickly, and he's got these huge scissors, and he cuts out this sort of leaf-like shape, and then he does just exactly what you say. He's got a piece of paper in front of him, and he's got all these different shapes down on the paper, and he keeps trying out different arrangements. Yeah, and sometimes he overlaps or he changes the direction, and it's great fun to play with that way. And you can see it's got this kind of immediacy that's very appealing. And of course, work for Matisse because he could no longer paint really. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you again, Pamela. You were wonderful as usual.
You're welcome. Thank you, Patty.
So nice to see you again.
Thank you all for coming, and we so appreciate it. And Pamela, thank you. Thank you for doing this for us.
You're welcome.
These presentations so much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Goodbye, everybody, and hope to see you here at some point, or maybe you'll see me for another Zoom session. So maybe this fall or next year. So that would be fun. I'd be more than happy to meet up with you all again.